All right, students, marching right along with slide number 6 on global logistics. The global supply chain overview is pretty straightforward. This ain't rocket science. It's global economies that drive global supply chains. Here's the new news. Global supply chain integration normally happens within stages with global supply. You know how we talked about in the course about manage and move inventory while balancing cost and service? Doing what? Using integrated systems. Most global supply chains do not have integrated systems. And we'll talk about why in a little bit. So that is a huge negative in supporting efficient global supply chains. Global sourcing or importing, those decisions are complex. Remember, we get into all the nuances of culture and trust, and they require thorough analysis, like the case that you're doing in the course. So we want the decisions to be based on data and quantitative, and we also want to use common sense and our experience in what the total true costs are, both TLLC and any hidden costs that may occur. And we'll get into that a little bit later on. Now, global economics, or global economies, I should say, that affects most firms. Most firms are doing some global sourcing of either, most US firms are doing some global sourcing of either materials or products. And why? Because we're trying to drive down total lease landed costs, and we had the slide earlier about how much volume we've lost as an exporter because of the high cost of labor. How do you get around that? Automation. And from the export standpoint, you do have global customers from time to time who want to buy your goods. The main objective to go global is down at the bottom, is to drive down the total least landed cost of the product. You want to reduce the direct manufacturing cost component using cheaper resources and cheaper labor. So that's why it's been happening, guys. And I think that's very obvious to us. It's just logical and it makes sense. I love this slide about global logistics management. Even though with my failing eyesight, I can't see this clip art that's in the lower left-hand side, but I can tell on the right part, we've got a map of the United States. On the left part, we've got source locations from China, Japan, and it looks like Indonesia area coming into the port of LA. And then there's some comments down here that I can't possibly read them. But what's really, I want you to have this stick with you, are the 5 major differences between domestic and international operations. We remember the performance cycle structure, 100 days of inventory. Transportation is driving that because of all that time on the ocean. Operational complexities, the whole thing about trust and the lack of integrated systems, and that's mentioned below. You have islands of information abounding. And something that I touched on in the beginning, and I have an example later on in the lecture about, because of the differences in, and you know I like to do the New York culture, differences in pace of work, that whole thing about book English versus native speaking English, all lead to key differences for sourcing from overseas versus staying within the US. Now, that performance cycle length is the most astounding difference between domestic sourcing and overseas sourcing. And you can just sum up this slide. It's all about the ocean freight and the slow transit times. You can throw customs clearance into that, becomes an issue from time to time. And there you have it on the bottom right corner. 14 weeks of supply is the net of that. And what are those 14 weeks of supply components that I want you to know for the exam? Production cycles 2, and the other 2 elements are 6 each. So it's easy. In transit 6, safety stock 6. Total of 14, we'll call it 100 days. If you're Apple, computer, you don't have 100 days. You've got 1 to 3. But for most companies that have a standard consumer packaged goods product line, you're dealing with 100 days of inventory. Now here's another look at the complexity from a global economy, and I just focused on the importing bullets. Increased uncertainty, greater distances and longer lead times. When is that product going to get here? Increased variability because of unique documentation requirements, all the paperwork that has to be filled out as product goes from one country to another. We have to make sure that we have all the customs clearances set up, all the tariffs are going to be paid, all the duties are going to be paid. There's nothing in that product that's going to harm consumers or anyone else. Shifting political environments. I mean, who knows what the leadership is going to be in China 5 years from now or 10 years from now. So will they still be business friendly to the US? Somebody's bombing the Rutgers computer network. Rumor has it, hackers in China. I just wonder if the US is going to turn around and say, you know what? We're really going to have to put some heavy duty tariffs on the products that you ship to the United States because we're really concerned about the relationship between the two countries, and the economic benefit that you're getting really is not being translated to a partnership all the way through from all the cyber issues that are going on. Of course, the US is probably doing the same thing, so and I think that's why we haven't called them out on it. And none of this has a damn thing to do with the business case, but shifting political environments did require, at least I thought so, some commentary from me. And here's the other issue on the right-hand side is that you have less control. When it's your factory in your company, when it's your factory in your country, then you know what expectations are and everyone is aligned. But when you're sourcing from overseas, the majority of the time that's not your plant. That's what's called a co-packer or a contract manufacturer who's producing for you on Monday and John Doe on Tuesday and Jane Doe on Wednesday. And so as this contract manufacturer is looking to make their revenue and profits, they want to just keep their plant running. And I mentioned the crinkled handshake before. I often wonder if production delays that I've encountered for products being sourced from overseas are really due to somebody else that's having their products run at that same factory paying a bribe to get their products moved ahead of the products that I'm responsible for that I thought were going to be made on a certain day. So that's when you get into decreased control, can be a whole thing about trust and making sure now you put people on your payroll who are there to be another set of eyes in that factory when the volume warrants it, to make sure that production occurs as planned. And of course, there's the whole deal about travel costs, to have a presence to make sure that you are not being forgotten about by the co-packer that's making your product. And potential customs requirements, the trade restrictions by governments, that all comes into play with having product imported, and that's as well as an export issue. And we also have decreased visibility. You know, there's no TMS that I know of for these ocean vessels. So you don't get timely communication and updates about the ETAs. And even when you do, the whole thing can blow up because there's a typhoon and the ship had to stay in port for an extra 3 days, which just puts it further behind, and it leads to all that variation in the transit time. There are longer transit times, longer holding times, and as I said, less ability to track the shipments, which segues right into the information systems integration is a major challenge, and it's a setback. It normally significantly lags the acquisition or a merger or a decision to source from overseas because it requires a substantial capital investment, and nobody's really sure if this is a strategy that's going to work long term. So you wind up having two types of systems, two sets of books: the ERP system that's completely integrated that we talked about before, and our global system, which are islands of information. A big exception to this is Caterpillar, and they hire out of Rutgers, MBA and undergraduates. So they come and talk to classes that I teach, and they are really impressive with the way that they have gone about doing more exporting than importing, and the systems that they have fully integrated throughout their whole operation to make true least cost sourcing decisions. So this is not something that they take lightly. They run their business based on having integrated systems, and they have made the commitment in technology, investments in technology, to do that. But they are the exception. And just from the characteristics of the three major areas, North America, when we look at our logistics network, that's fairly easy, open geography, extensive transportation options, and limited cross-border documentation. In Europe, much more complex for the reasons indicated here. And in the Pacific Rim, very complex with the island-based geography and relatively poor infrastructure. So you better hope that your co-packer is close to a port, because if they aren't, there are all sorts of delays in getting product from an inland factory to the port because of poor roads and monsoon rains and everything else that you can imagine. So we know we have big transportation bucks coming from the Pacific Rim, and Europe ain't cheap either. I like the 4Ds as the challenges to global operations. Easy to remember 4Ds, right? Demand, diversity, so there's that culture again, distance, and here's documentation with that ton of paperwork that's required, and it's very hard to automate that. Now, just as a touch on cultural differences, you know, one of the reasons that I have us do the optimal pallet drills so that we understand what it takes to be moving full, since that's a key to driving down costs. One of the reasons I have us do that is because nobody else at Church and Dwight had their eye on it. And shame on us in supply chain that we didn't come up with these standards previously. So as we rolled our standards out for optimal pallets, there were some products that were being made in France to be sold in the US. And I thought this would take about an hour and a half to get the French to convert the pallet pattern. They needed to remove a tier because international containers are normally 90 inches tall, and the pallet was unable to be stacked too high in the container because it was too tall. So I thought it would be relatively straightforward, just remove a layer, remove a tier, so we can double stack it. Oh, and by the way, the pallets that they use over there are based on centimeters, and they aren't 48 by 40. They wind up being more like 47 by 39. So that's the European footprint. And they had the pallet at 50 inches high, wood and product. And I mentioned before that Europe ships on pallets. Unlike Asia, Asia is normally floor loaded. We covered this previously in chapter 10. So Europe typically ships on pallets because they have high labor costs similar to the US. Would you believe it took 2 years to get this done? Multiple phone calls, issues with my inability to parlez-vous français, their inability to understand English wasn't a priority to them, that it took 2 years to get it done, and I thought it'd be done in an hour. So there you are, a living example of differences in the culture and pace. So it ain't easy managing overseas locations from a long distance, even when we were all working for the same company. This wasn't a co-packer. This was a subsidiary company, part of Church and Dwight. So everything that we've been talking about, you put it together, and global can often be our worst logistics nightmare. And that's again because most companies, they dabble with global sourcing. They don't invest in the technology because they're not sure whether or not it's a real trend or a fad. So kind of do it to get your toe in the water and learn what it takes. And because there's a lack of commitment, it means the systems and other structures are shoddy. They're not as robust as product being sourced from the US, with the exception of some serious firms out there like Caterpillar, like Apple. They do it right. And Caterpillar does both export and import. And they live by lease landed costs to source their tractors and earth movers and everything else that they do to their customers around the world. So with all the slides that you've been looking at and all the windage that you've been hearing from me about the 4Ds and our worst nightmare and 14 weeks of supply versus somewhere around what I picked 5 on this slide, which says that most companies are doing production cycles of every 4 to 6 weeks, and we see that when we calculate inventory turns. Most companies are getting about 8 turns. 8 into 52 goes 6 times. So, you know, there are the Church and Dwights that are getting 13 turns. So I picked 5 weeks of supply as well-run supply chains. Live with that. On the domestic side, that's what DOM stands for in slide number 17. And we have integrated systems. And logistics costs as a percent of sales runs about, from the Boston Consulting Group study that we referenced way back when, about 7%. And the network is fairly simple. About 4 to 5 DCs for companies that have high inventory turns and don't report the sales are sufficient for truckload shippers to be effective on both cost and service. We can live domestically with, remember, our 2 favorite F words, frequency and flexibility. And supply chain variation, though it exists, is relatively low. Now compare that to global. We came up with the 14 weeks of supply, the 100 days, the 3.6 inventory turns. Integrated systems are rare, so we're going to put an N down for no. Log costs as a percent of sales, hey, the sky's the limit. But often, companies will raise price if they have to use a lot of air freight because they screwed up their forecast, and therefore they're driving their cost north of this 20-25%. And I picked 25%. It's just an arbitrary number, but it's directionally right. The network is complex. We went through that before. The 2 favorite F words don't exist at all. You're lucky if you get production from overseas co-packers the same time every month, like you hope and plan will occur. Oh, there's always a reason why the product couldn't be run. And supply chain variation is huge, particularly around that long transit time by ocean. Okay? So I love this slide. This slide is really one to me that just puts all the previous verbiage down on one slide so that I think everybody gets it. I'd like to take a break here and go over the third segment of the lecture, which will be making the sourcing decisions. You remember kind of the subtitle of this chapter is to be or not to be, to import or not. So let's hold up here. We talked about all the complexity, and we'll move into the guidelines for making sourcing decisions.